Clowns, they're supposed to be cheerful, whimsical, and the life of the party. With their painted smiles and exaggerated features, they're meant to bring joy to children and laughter to the crowd. But what happens when those smiles feel a little too wide? When their presence feels less like fun and more like a shadow lurking at the edge of your vision? For many people, clowns exist in a strange space between humor and horror. Their masks of painted cheer hide their true emotions, leaving us to wonder what lies beneath. This unease, coupled with the eerie persistence of their exaggerated actions, has made clowns the perfect embodiment of fear in countless stories. But in this video, we're not talking about fictional tales or movie monsters. These are 5 real-life encounters where clowns stepped out of the carnival lights and into the shadows of terror. From dark forests to lonely roads, from innocent neighborhood carnivals to silent, stalking figures, these stories blur the line between harmless entertainment and bone-chilling horror. Imagine being approached by a clown who offers a friendly backstage tour, only for their grin to widen as they follow you into the darkness of the woods. Or walking home after a night of fun, only to find a mime-like figure hiding in the bushes outside your house. What about stumbling across a clown nose on the road, only to realize it belonged to someone, or something, that isn't ready to let it go? Each of these stories explores our deep, primal fear of the uncanny, the idea that something familiar, like a clown, can become so terrifyingly wrong. The narrators of these tales didn't just feel uneasy, they were pushed to the brink of fear, forced to confront what happens when innocence turns into menace. So, turn down the lights and prepare yourself. These are 5 dark clown horror stories that will make you think twice the next time you see a painted smile staring back at you. It was a warm summer evening, and the neighborhood park was alive with the sounds of laughter, music, and the occasional squeal of excitement from children. The annual carnival had returned, bringing with it colorful tents, carnival games, and performers. For 12-year-old Alex, this was the highlight of the summer, a chance to roam freely, hang out with friends, and enjoy the thrill of the rides. The carnival was set up near a forest preserve, its edge marked by towering trees that created a natural barrier between the festivities and the wilderness beyond. The forest had always felt a little mysterious to Alex, but tonight, it only added to the atmosphere. As he wandered through the carnival, Alex's attention was drawn to a large, striped tent where a group of clowns was performing. Inside, laughter erupted as they juggled, performed acrobatics, and made balloon animals for a crowd of delighted children. Alex stood near the entrance, watching with mild amusement. But then, something caught his eye. One of the clowns, dressed in black and white with streaks of red painted across his face, wasn't performing. Instead, he was standing off to the side, staring directly at Alex. His painted smile seemed larger than the others, his eyes darker, almost hollow. Slowly, the clown raised a gloved hand and waved. Alex felt a chill run down his spine. The clown's gaze was intense, unblinking. Alex looked away, pretending not to notice, and moved to another part of the carnival. But the feeling of being watched lingered. Later that evening, as Alex explored the far edge of the carnival near the forest preserve, he saw the same clown again. This time, the man approached him, his movements slow and deliberate. "Hey, kid," the clown said, his voice oddly flat, devoid of the usual cheer associated with carnival performers. "Want a backstage tour? See how the magic happens?" Alex shook his head quickly. "No thanks," he mumbled, backing away. He didn't wait for the clown to respond. Instead, he turned and headed toward the forest, hoping to lose him in the trees. But as Alex ventured deeper into the woods, the sense of unease grew. The laughter and music of the carnival faded behind him, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the sound of his own footsteps crunching on the forest floor. He glanced over his shoulder and froze. The clown was following him. The man's painted smile seemed even more sinister in the moonlight. He didn't run or shout, he simply walked, his footsteps steady, the echo of his movements amplifying the tension. Alex's heart raced as he quickened his pace, weaving through the trees and trying to lose the man in the darkness. But every time he looked back, the clown was still there, closing the distance. Finally, Alex's fear turned to desperation. He grabbed his flashlight, the only object he had, and hurled it at the clown with all his strength. The flashlight struck the man in the chest, and he stumbled, letting out a low grunt. Alex didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran as fast as he could, the sound of his own breathing drowning out everything else. When Alex finally reached the edge of the forest and the safety of his neighborhood, he didn't stop running until he was home. He locked the door behind him and peered out the window, half expecting to see the clown standing on the street. but there was no sign of him. That night, Alex lay in bed, his mind racing. He thought about telling his mom, but fear held him back. What if she forbade him from going to the carnival next year? What if she didn't believe him? Alex decided to keep the encounter to himself, but the memory lingered. For weeks after, he avoided the forest and stayed close to home, jumping at every sound and shadow. Even now, years later, Alex can still see the clown's hollow eyes and painted smile in his mind, a haunting reminder of the danger that sometimes hides in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadow. It was a crisp fall evening when 14-year-old Dylan and his best friend, Brandon, or B, as everyone called him, decided to visit the carnival that had popped up in their town's parking lot. The vibrant lights, blaring music, and the smell of fried food were hard to resist. It wasn't often that anything exciting happened in their small town, so the two boys were eager to explore the attractions and enjoy a night of freedom. As they wandered through the bustling carnival, they laughed at the cheesy games and dared each other to ride the rickety Ferris wheel. Everything seemed perfectly normal, until they noticed him. Standing near a booth at the far end of the lot was a clown unlike the others they'd seen performing tricks and making balloon animals. This one was different. He wasn't interacting with the crowd or trying to entertain. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his white-painted face illuminated by the flickering carnival lights. His outfit was more muted than the others, a faded black and white ensemble, with no bright colors to soften his appearance. But it wasn't his clothes that unnerved Dylan and B, it was the way he stared. The clown's dark eyes were fixed on them, his expression eerily blank beneath the painted red smile. At first, they thought he was just trying to scare them, part of some spooky carnival act. But as they continued to move through the crowd, they realized he wasn't staying in one place. Every time they glanced back, he seemed closer, inching toward them with unnaturally smooth movements. "Dude, what's his deal?" Dylan whispered to B, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know," B replied, his eyes darting nervously toward the clown. "Let's just keep walking." The boys picked up their pace, weaving through the crowd in an attempt to lose the unsettling figure. For a while, they thought it had worked. They didn't see him near any of the booths or rides. Relieved, they decided to leave the carnival and head home. The walk back was quieter than usual. The excitement of the evening had been overshadowed by the creepy encounter, and both boys couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional car passing by. The only sounds were their footsteps on the pavement and the distant hum of carnival music fading into the background. As they approached Dylan's house, something in the bushes caught their attention. It was subtle at first, a faint rustling, like an animal moving through the leaves. Dylan stopped, squinting into the darkness. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Yeah," B replied, his voice low. "What is it?" Before Dylan could respond, the rustling grew louder. And then they saw him. The clown. He was crouched low in the bushes, partially hidden by the shadows, but his pale face was unmistakable. His painted smile seemed to stretch even wider in the dim light, and his dark eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity. "Oh my God," B muttered, taking a step back. "What is he doing?" The clown didn't move at first. He just stared, his head tilting slightly as if he were studying them. Then, slowly, he rose from his crouch, standing to his full height. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to send chills down their spines. "Run," Dylan whispered, his voice barely audible. The boys bolted toward Dylan's house, their hearts pounding as they sprinted up the driveway. They fumbled with the keys, their hands shaking as they unlocked the door and slammed it shut behind them. Without hesitation, they locked every bolt and ran upstairs, peering out the window to see if the clown had followed them. He was standing in the yard, just beyond the glow of the porch light. His head tilted slightly as if listening, his painted smile frozen in place. He didn't move closer. He didn't knock on the door. He just stood there, staring up at the house. Minutes felt like hours as the boys watched him, too terrified to look away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the clown turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the street. For days, Dylan and B couldn't shake the memory of that night. They avoided talking about it, as if speaking the words would somehow bring the clown back. Dylan's parents brushed off their story, dismissing it as a prank by one of the carnival workers. But Dylan knew better. Even now, years later, he remembers the way the clown stood in the yard, unmoving, his eerie silence more terrifying than any words could have been. Every fall, when the leaves start to change and the air turns crisp, Dylan can't help but glance toward the bushes, half expecting to see that pale face staring back at him. In a quiet, rural town in South Carolina, life was simple but hard. For 14-year-old Jacob, his routine was split between school and his job at the local lumberyard. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid enough to help his family. Most evenings, Jacob would walk home alone, his path lit only by the occasional street lamp and the soft glow of fireflies in the distance. One night, as Jacob was finishing up his shift, his co-workers warned him about staying out too late. "You hear about those clowns people been seeing around here?" one of them asked. "A burly man named Ed. People say they're lurking near the woods, scaring folks. Some say it's a prank, others say it's something worse." Jacob laughed it off. "You believe in those stories? Probably just some bored kids." Ed shrugged but didn't press further. Jacob, though curious, dismissed the warnings as nothing more than small-town gossip. It wasn't until later that he'd realized just how real those stories were. As he walked home that night, the air was unusually still, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. He was halfway down the long, dark road that cut through the woods when he heard it, a high-pitched laugh, faint but distinct. Jacob stopped in his tracks, straining his ears. The sound came again, this time louder, echoing through the trees. His heart began to race. "Probably just some animal," he muttered to himself, quickening his pace. But as the laughter grew closer, it became clear this was no animal. The sound was human, playful, yet deeply unsettling. Jacob turned, shining the flashlight he carried for the walk home. The beam cut through the darkness but revealed nothing. The laughter stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its place. Swallowing his fear, Jacob continued down the road, his pace now bordering on a jog. The next morning, Jacob couldn't shake the memory of the night before. As he walked to the lumberyard, he spotted something strange lying in the middle of the road, a bright red clown nose. It looked dirty and scuffed, as though it had been dropped and left to the elements. Jacob picked it up, chuckling nervously. "Guess the clowns are real after all," he joked with himself. At work, he showed it to his co-workers, who laughed and teased him about his newfound souvenir. Ed, however, looked uneasy. "You sure you want to keep that thing? Feels like bad luck." Jacob brushed it off. "It's just a stupid piece of plastic." But that night, as Jacob walked home, the strange laughter returned. It was louder this time, more deliberate, as though someone was following him. His flashlight revealed nothing but trees and shadows, yet the sound seemed to come from all around him. He quickened his pace, his grip tightening on the handle of his flashlight. Then, in the distance, he saw a figure. At first, he thought it was an animal, a deer, maybe. But as he got closer, his blood turned cold. It wasn't a deer. It was a person. The figure stepped into the faint light of his flashlight, revealing a filthy clown suit, its once bright colors now muted and stained. The clown's face was pale and smudged, its painted smile uneven and cracked. It tilted its head, its dark eyes locking onto Jacob. "You've got something of mine," the clown said, its voice high-pitched and sing-song, yet tinged with menace. Jacob froze, his heart hammering in his chest. "What are you talking about?" he managed to stammer. The clown raised a gloved hand and pointed. "My nose," it said, its grin widening unnaturally. "You took it. And if you don't give it back..." The clown reached behind its back and pulled out a long, rusted machete. "I'll take yours." The sight of the blade snapped Jacob out of his paralysis. He turned and ran, the sound of the machete dragging against the ground echoing behind him. The clown's laughter grew louder, more frenzied, as it gave chase. Jacob's lungs burned as he sprinted down the dark road, the clown's footsteps closing in. Just as he thought he couldn't run any farther, headlights appeared in the distance. A truck barreled down the road, its horn blaring as it approached. The clown stopped abruptly, retreating into the shadows. Jacob waved frantically at the truck, which slowed to a stop beside him. The driver, a gruff-looking man with a concerned expression, rolled down the window. "You okay, kid? What's going on?" "There's a clown," Jacob gasped, pointing toward the woods. "It was chasing me." The man grabbed a flashlight and scanned the area, but there was no sign of the clown. "You sure about that?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Jacob could only nod, too shaken to speak. The man offered him a ride home, and Jacob accepted without hesitation. As they drove, Jacob kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the clown's face appear in the trees. But the road remained empty. For weeks, Jacob avoided walking home at night. He eventually threw the clown nose away, hoping to rid himself of whatever curse seemed to follow it. But even now, years later, he can still hear that laughter in his nightmares. And every so often, when he walks alone in the dark, he can't help but glance over his shoulder, afraid that the clown might return to claim what it believes is rightfully his. At 16 years old, Emily wasn't afraid of much. She prided herself on being the type of person who could brush off creepy stories and handle a good scare. But even Emily couldn't have anticipated the unsettling events that would unfold during what was supposed to be a fun night at the carnival. It was the last weekend of summer, and the annual traveling carnival had rolled into town, setting up in the large field near the high school. Emily and her friends, Lauren and Mike, decided to check it out, eager to make the most of their final days of freedom before school started again. The evening started out normal enough: bright lights, the smell of popcorn and funnel cakes, and the sound of kids laughing as they raced from ride to ride. The trio roamed through the carnival, trying their luck at ring toss and other games while occasionally stopping for snacks. As the night wore on, Emily began to notice something strange. A clown dressed in a tattered, oversized suit seemed to be lingering near them. At first, she thought it was part of the act. Carnival clowns were supposed to be everywhere, entertaining guests and adding to the whimsical atmosphere. But this clown was different. He didn't perform tricks or juggle like the others. Instead, he stood silently, just far enough away to blend into the crowd, but close enough to make his presence known. His white face paint was cracked and uneven, and his eyes were heavily rimmed with black, giving him a hollow, sunken appearance. His painted red smile was smeared, stretched unnaturally wide, as though it had been hastily applied. "Hey, do you guys see that clown?" Emily whispered to her friends as they stood in line for the Ferris wheel. Lauren glanced over her shoulder and shrugged. "Probably just some weirdo trying to be spooky. It's a carnival." Mike, always the skeptic, laughed. "It's his job to look creepy. Relax." But Emily couldn't relax. Even as they rode the Ferris wheel, she could see the clown standing near the base, staring up at their carriage. He didn't move, didn't interact with anyone else. He was just watching. When they got off the ride, Emily suggested leaving. "I've had enough of this place," she said, trying to keep her tone casual. Her friends reluctantly agreed, and they started making their way toward the parking lot. As they walked, the feeling of being followed became impossible to ignore. Emily glanced over her shoulder and saw the clown trailing behind them, his pace slow but deliberate. He wasn't trying to hide. If anything, it seemed like he wanted them to know he was there. "All right, this is getting weird," Lauren said, noticing the clown for the first time. "Why is he following us?" "Let's just keep walking," Mike muttered, his bravado starting to fade. "We'll lose him in the parking lot." But they didn't. The clown stayed close, weaving through the thinning crowd as they approached the darkened lot. By the time they reached Emily's car, the clown had stopped at the edge of the field, partially obscured by the shadows. His head tilted slightly, his painted smile still visible even in the dim light. "Get in," Emily said, unlocking the car with trembling hands. They piled in quickly, locking the doors and staring out the windows. The clown hadn't moved. He just stood there, watching as the car's engine roared to life. Emily sped out of the lot, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. The silence in the car was deafening as they drove through the empty streets, the glow of the carnival lights fading into the distance. "What the hell was his problem?" Lauren finally asked, breaking the tension. "I don't know," Emily replied, her voice shaky. "But I'm glad we're out of there." Just as they began to relax, a movement in the rearview mirror caught Emily's attention. Her blood ran cold. The clown was there, sitting in a car a few lengths behind them, its headlights off, barely visible in the dim glow of the streetlights. "Guys," Emily said, her voice trembling. "He's following us." Mike turned to look, his face pale. "What the hell? How did he?" "Doesn't matter," Emily interrupted. "I'm not driving home." Instead, she turned onto a side street, taking random turns in an attempt to lose the clown. But no matter where they went, the car stayed with them, its engine silent, its headlights still off. Emily's heart pounded as she drove faster, her mind racing for a plan. Finally, she spotted the entrance to a brightly lit gas station. Without hesitation, she pulled in, parking near the entrance. "We're staying here," she said firmly. "He won't do anything with other people around." Sure enough, the clown's car slowed as it passed the gas station but didn't pull in. Instead, it disappeared into the darkness of the street, leaving the three of them shaken but relieved. Emily didn't drive home that night. Instead, They waited at the gas station for what felt like hours before calling a family friend to come and escort them. Even after they were safely home, Emily couldn't shake the memory of the clown's painted face or the way he had silently followed them without a word. To this day, Emily avoids carnivals. She doesn't know who the clown was or what he wanted, but the thought of that painted smile and those hollow eyes still haunts her. And every time she drives at night, she can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, afraid that he might be there, watching, waiting. It was a few months after the first clown sightings began to make headlines. Across the country, reports were coming in, people claiming to see clowns lurking in wooded areas, around schools, and even outside homes. Some of the stories seemed harmless, pranksters looking for a thrill, but others hinted at something darker. For 15-year-old Ethan, clowns had always been unsettling. He never liked their exaggerated features or the way their painted smiles seemed to hide something sinister. So, when the news started covering these clown sightings, he paid attention, carefully listening to the stories and piecing them together. But he never thought he'd have his own encounter. One autumn evening, Ethan was walking home from his friend Josh's house. The route took him along a quiet back road that cut through the woods. The sun had already set, and the moonlight barely penetrated the canopy of trees above. He had walked this path countless times before, but tonight, it felt different, too quiet, too still. About halfway home, Ethan heard it, faint laughter echoing through the trees. He stopped, his heart skipping a beat. It wasn't the warm, joyful laughter you'd hear at a party. This was sharp and high-pitched, almost childlike, but with an edge that sent chills down his spine. He scanned the woods, his eyes darting between the shadows. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. The laughter stopped abruptly, plunging the area into silence. For a moment, Ethan thought he had imagined it, but then a rustling sound came from the trees to his right. "Josh, if this is you messing with me, it's not funny," Ethan said, trying to sound braver than he felt. There was no response. He quickened his pace, his footsteps echoing loudly on the pavement. But the rustling followed, keeping pace with him, just out of sight. Finally, Ethan broke into a jog, his breath coming in short bursts. He didn't stop until he reached his front porch, slamming the door shut and locking it behind him. As he peered out the window, he thought he saw movement at the edge of the woods, a flash of white and red, but it disappeared before he could be sure. The next day at school, Ethan told Josh what had happened. Josh laughed it off, saying, "Dude, you've been watching too many of those clown videos online." Ethan wasn't convinced. His nerves were still on edge, and his fears were validated when he found something unusual on his front lawn that evening. A balloon tied to a small tree, its string wrapped tightly around the bark. The balloon was red, with the words, "Want to play?" scrawled across it in black marker. Ethan's stomach churned. He hadn't seen anyone near his house, and the thought that someone had been on his property made his skin crawl. He popped the balloon, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. That night, as he lay in bed, Ethan heard a noise outside, soft tapping on his window. He froze, his heart pounding. Slowly, he turned his head toward the sound. Through the thin curtains, he could see the outline of a figure. It was tall, with broad shoulders and something round on its head, a hat, maybe? Or a wig? Ethan slid out of bed and crept toward the window, his hands trembling as he pulled the curtain back slightly. His blood ran cold. Standing outside, just a few feet from the glass, was a clown. Its face was pale, with exaggerated red lips curved into a wide grin. Its eyes were rimmed in black, giving them a hollow, sunken look. The clown raised a gloved hand and waved slowly, its smile never faltering. Ethan stumbled backward, his mind racing. He grabbed his phone and called the police, stammering out what he'd seen. By the time officers arrived, the clown was gone, leaving only a muddy footprint below the window as proof it had been there. The next morning, Ethan's dad found another balloon tied to their mailbox. This one read, "See you soon." Over the next few weeks, similar stories began to surface around town. People reported seeing clowns in the woods, on quiet streets, and even near schools. Each encounter seemed random, yet eerily coordinated, as if the clowns were working together. Rumors of a clown cult began to circulate, an organized group targeting small towns, their motives unclear. Ethan became obsessed with the theory. He scoured online forums, reading accounts from people who claimed to have encountered similar clowns. The stories were hauntingly familiar: sightings near homes, cryptic messages left behind, and in some cases, clowns breaking into houses or chasing people through the woods. One night, Ethan stumbled upon a post that made his stomach drop. It was a photo, blurry but unmistakable, a group of clowns standing in a clearing, their faces painted with exaggerated grins. The caption read, "Seen in South Carolina woods, just before dusk." Who are they? Ethan recognized the forest in the photo. It was near his town. That weekend, a friend of Ethan's younger brother came over, pale and trembling. He claimed he'd seen a clown on the edge of the schoolyard during recess. It didn't chase him, but it stood there for nearly an hour, watching, before disappearing into the woods. For Ethan, the pieces were starting to come together. These weren't random pranks. Something bigger was happening, something organized, calculated. The thought terrified him. Eventually, the sightings in his town stopped, but the memory of those weeks left a lasting impression on Ethan. Even years later, he still finds himself looking over his shoulder when walking alone at night, scanning the shadows for any hint of white face paint or a painted smile. And every so often, he checks online forums, searching